Synopsis. Life passes by, much like water passing under a bridge, each wave a new experience. This is a story about a boy who grew up during the 1930s, was schooled in the 40s, to start work in the 50s. The tale describes suburban society, its pleasures and pains, his parents' home and school life, and finally his working conditions in 1950. It's a true story. It's told through the narrator's recollections as his memories move from one topic to the next. And as all good stories do about families, it is as much to do about the parents as the child. School should be about learning necessary information to prepare each individual child to be able to enjoy life to the full and prosper. All ages have outstanding features associated with human beings and their progress. The 30s shook off bad after-war social and work conditions. The 40s was all about solidarity and purpose to defeat the country's enemies. And the 50s welcomed a new National Welfare Reform Act under Labour. Introduction. Although the synopsis describes the topic of this book, the writer has purposely ducked this way and that as his mind has wandered, associating one object with thoughts of another, building up the picture in the round whilst working towards a completed text. The aim has been to tell the story accurately and give moment and feeling to the subject. It is the intricacies of daily living that have been prized apart to reveal the foundation of the subject. It's a well-known fact that the older we become, the more we look back. The object of our thoughts are mostly challenges, difficult decisions and banana skins. And how many times do we trip over them? Do we always come to the same conclusions? If only the oft-repeated word, and it is true that we could have been so much better had we adopted a more positive frame of mind. I wonder how many term reports have been predicated could have done better. Some of my thoughts have been somewhat trifling and insubstantial, but in the course of one's daily life they are the backbone of a person's make-up compared to another's. So I have let my thoughts take me for a ride, hoping we will all arrive together, all the better for the trip. Quite often you read in the newspapers, in the letters column, or whilst listening to the radio, that correspondents and listeners reveal that they would have wished their parents and grandparents to have told them a bit more about their early life, but failed to do so before they became no longer available. Although my father did type his thoughts about his life, leaving out both wars, they concentrated mainly on his schooling. He also felt put upon, meaning not given sufficient recognition. He applied for a junior clerk's vacancy at Paddington Station in 1904, when he was 15, only to be told that there wasn't one available, but that he should apply to Thompson, Mackay and Co. This he did, and secured a job the same year. He served with the company until the amalgamation in 1921, 100 years ago, forming the Great Western Railway Company. The railway unions didn't allow outside bodies to have precedence over railwaymen, which meant Albert dropped out of seniority for the rest of his working life. I too have had their yearnings, been no different from those media correspondents wanting more information about my parents' past, for I too had been told very little. This stimulated both my brother and I to delve deeply into their past. He built the family tree, and I wrote the history. Of course, it wasn't that easy, nor did it happen overnight. His work, of which I'm very grateful for, took many arduous years. Mine, as you can see, is ongoing. Now I have reached an age when I have turned to reflection, giving the past time to gel and become stable. And with that in mind, and having given voice to my thoughts, I shall try and answer my children, who have uttered the age-old question, what was it like? So here goes. I shall look back and see what I can remember. I cannot swear to get the writing in proper order, though. So don't expect guns to go off or sparks to fly. There's nothing teeth-clenchingly awful to reveal, although they were exciting times, and for students interested in the past, they were interesting times too. To help you on your way, I've given an overview of the characters and some pictures to stimulate your interest, to give a background to the world about. I hope you like the tales I've chosen and that they have prompted you to question your own place in history. By the 1930s, about 1/3 of women worked outside the home. Many orphans were still being shipped off to the colonies or offered up for adoption. This was stopped by the 1939 Adoption of Children Act. I've written a number of books all to do with the family and society, and little did I expect to be involved in a pandemic which some of the family have suffered from, and another died. As I write, America has a new president who will devote himself to bringing the American nation together, and I have an injection to have. On top of all this, the country is leaving the European community. Hey-ho, here we go again. Since my birth, society has gone through a number of changes, and these changes have been in keeping with a growing society, not necessarily in numbers, but in relationships, revealing past history and scientific knowledge. The extension of life, number of births, and the education of all, plus the position of women, space exploration, and genetics, have been infused with modern analytical judgments. These are all the latest points of interest for scientists and intellectuals. My interests have been about the past, why I behave and think in a certain way, and who influenced those thoughts. The period covered in this book captures an international war and 2 Far Eastern wars. Each war brought about a slowing up in the speed of prosperity, economic growth, material standards and lifestyle. The international effects of each slowing education and welfare. The pandemic has also had its effect over all advancements except knowledge about viruses and virus production and turnout. Those wars promoted the worthwhileness of women in work situations, and this once more pushed forward women's liberation movement, their pay, holidays, security and job recognition. The house I was born in was built by Horace Cutler as were many others, all looking very much the same, with rough cast walls and tiled roof, a small front garden with side entrance to a rear garden about 5 times the size of the front. There weren't any garages, because at the time of building the house owners would not have had the salary to afford one, and of course during the war all civilian car driving for pleasure was banned. And from my memory, no house owner in Cumberland Road, North Harrow, owned a car before the war was over in 1946. The view of Harrow on the Hill and its public school gives an idea of the farmland round about. At the time of the Metropolitan Railway track was laid, the satellite villages, hamlets, farms and isolated cottages were ousted by government expansion schemes, the suburban house-building companies and their promoters. The estate agents' 1930s posters declared the area London's Garden Towns, which was certainly romantic, if not a little misleading. Towns such as Wembley, West Hampstead, Preston Road, Northwick Park, Kenton, South, North, West Harrow, Rayners Lane, Pinner Green, Headstone, Hatch End and Northwood Hills were to be developed using the Watford Metropolitan and Railway Aylesbury line as commuter links to London. The view of the Embassy Cinema, the only main crossroads, Station Road bisecting the Pinner Road, gives the viewer a typical perspective of the time and place, an ambience that is never to be repeated or even imagined, of space, genteel living, time and dignity, with its banks perched at each corner to reinforce solidarity and reliability. 2 descriptive words very much to the fore at the time. If you walk up Station Road, past the bus stop outside St Andrew's School to the crossroads, turn left, there's an imposing bank, hairdressers, cafe, cycle shop and a shop selling hobbies. Continuing on Pinner Road leads to West Harrow and Harrow Central. Turning right at the crossroads takes you past another bank to the Embassy Cinema, United Dairies, bookshop and another bank on the corner of Canterbury Road. Continuing up the road there are shops to the left, the town clock in the centre, council houses opposite, and next to the car showrooms more shops take you up to the Methodist Church just by the crossroads, over which is Headstone School playing field. Further along George V Avenue, on the right, lies Hall's Farm, the nearest farm to North Harrow that supplied its own bottled milk, cream and butter by horse-drawn milk cart to the surrounding houses. On the left, a winding track leads you to Snow White's cottage perched at the top of the hill. During the war, the field alongside George V Avenue held a gun battery and searchlight. Back to the main crossroads, walking straight over the crossroads takes you past more shops left and right, and further on over Cambridge Road towards the train station. On the other side of the road, Headstone Arms and Hotel. Continue under the railway bridge, where there are a few more shops to the left and right before the first houses along Imperial Drive that leads to St Albans Church, Rayners Lane and Hanger Lane. In the late 30s, the local, if not national feeling was one of the country advancing into prosperity, although the international feeling was one of uncertainty and fear of Germany, rearming at a colossal rate. Morris Motors, at the time Britain's premier motor car producer, registered in 1912, was by 1937 manufacturing tanks and munitions in Birmingham, later in Coventry, making an effort to readjust the country's discrepancy. In 1933, London Transport was formed an amalgamation of the capital's tram, trolleybus, bus and tube. The expansion of the Metropolitan line from Marylebone, Baker Street to Watford, and the Great Western from Paddington to Aylesbury opened up the countryside from Edgware Road to Northwood and Chorley Wood. In the 30s, all trains were driven by steam, and the carriages were provided with slam doors. Chapter 1. Home. I could never have imagined that I would be here in 2021, sitting at my desk writing out memories of a childhood. Played out getting on for 90 years ago on a Chinese laptop word processor, a boy from the northwestern London Garden suburb who played amidst the bomb damage, collected shrapnel, watched London burn at night, and traced the searchlight trying to find bombers in the night sky, ever worried that the Atlantic convoys with oil, food and ore would be blockaded by Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz U-boats. It is difficult to write about the police, who in 1930 and thereafter were held in such high esteem. We were brought up to respect the law and the local bobby. If you, as a child, was doing anything wrong, you would expect no kind words, but perhaps a clip round the ear. And in 1933, the minimum age for hanging was raised to 18. The advent in car driving, which was stopped during the war and then promoted after in 1946, meant that the police force needed to keep pace with the ease of robberies, attending the scene, responding, and escapes. My earliest memories are good-night kisses, saying my prayers, having Vic Vapor Rub rubbed onto my chest, and having cod liver oil and malt spooned into my mouth, whilst playing with my brother, who was 11 months older than I, who acted like a circus ringmaster, planning and delivering his acts, I being the ever-available performer. Our lead soldiers came pretty much top of the must-do list, ending with my fort being shot to pieces. These games, carefully stage-managed by us both, being dressed in cowboy and Indian dress, took place on the garden, where our Oppin trench has been filled in, being surplus to requirements. We played like this for our first 3 years until he went to school, leaving me behind to have the run of the toy cupboard. Throughout our childhoods, manufacturing a soapbox cart came out as a first-class guaranteed time-waster, an occupier of time. Climbing down ropes from the bedroom window came a very close second. We use the garden steps that lead down onto the lawn as a natural slalom to see who could get further along the randomly paved garden path. Naturally, his longer paddling legs propelled him further. Unfortunately, the bumping soapbox didn't take kindly to the uneven surface, soon needing attention in the pits, the pram wheels taking a severe beating. Stan and I slept in a double bed in the second bedroom. When Stan was about 8, he contracted glandular fever, which meant isolation and to remain in bed for some weeks. The bed was turned round, pushed against the wall to allow me to have my own bed by the door. In winter I had my father's army greatcoat thrown over my bed. North Harrow was blessed with a number of parks and gardens. Our nearest was Streamside Walk, a winding asphalted path leading you beside the River Pin, with stone bridges, seating, flower beds and abundance of trees. The park keeper had his hut, and it was his job to control the children and keep the walkways clean and tidy. All cycling and rowdiness forbidden. Pinner Park was further up the road, the park where we played cricket. The tennis courts and the children's playground ensured that this is where the park had the majority of children in the play area. Headstone Park was accessed from Hatch End, one side, and North Harrow on the other. This is where the bands played on the bandstand in the summer, and Besborough cricket team had their ground surrounded by tall poplar trees. The moated farmhouse and stables provided an enclosed area when raining for the band to play, plays to be acted out, and council meetings staged. It is now a heritage area with a museum and library. The Second World War was relayed by radio and film to a fearful audience who were not prevented from knowing the worst tidings. At our country's most trying periods, the populace was gripping the arms of its chairs, cheering on the unbelievable heroics of the Russian forces as the Germans were being forced back from Moscow. If ever the Russians needed supporters, the bulk of Britain were there, ever in their debt, cheering them on, the Russian bear in the form of Marshal Zhukov, 1846 to 1974, leading the charge. The period is remembered by certain tunes and voices that immediately, when heard, take one back. They painted a picture and were synonymous with the times. Sailing By, composed by Ronald Binge, By the Sleepy Lagoon by Eric Coates, Dreaming by Sidney Baines, The Watermill by Ronald Binge, and Marigold by Billy Mayle. Derek McCulloch, radio's Uncle Mac, Ed Murrow, the war correspondent, Gene Metcalf, the radio presenter, and Eamon Andrews, who was also a radio presenter. The newspapers traced our army's defeats and advances using maps to explain each movement. These we studied, learning as much about geography as any school lesson. For us boys, it was exciting, the worrying aspects not realized nor spoken about by our parents. It wasn't a question of losing a war, because that was never ever given a possibility. It was about winning battles, pushing the Germans back, who had the fastest plane, who had the longest gun, and who had the heaviest tank. I dreamt of German parachutists, spies and sabotage, listened to Lord Haw on the radio, proclaiming Britain's defeat whilst tracking the retreats and advances of British troops throughout the world as the nation listened to Victor Sylvester's orchestra on the radio and Vera Lynn singing We'll Meet Again. How did the country survive the unbelievable catastrophes caused by tragic mismanagements wrought by the War Office and Chiefs of Staff, allowing such bad decisions to be continued, to become ultimate disasters. It's difficult to imagine. To go to war without knowing you are up against, knowing that the other side have been preparing for war for almost 10 years, was criminal. As for America, coming into the war at such a late stage, as if unable to see the wood from the trees, led to the lives of many, redeeming themselves only by lease lend, conveyor belt weapons production, and timely on-the-ground intervention. They too turned a blind eye on the obvious. I cast my mind back to thoughts of home, when my parents and us children were happy and secure, the war not long over, and the country's families together at last after 6 long years, steadily getting used to a war-free existence. I see the family sitting down before the fire, bathed in its warming glow, the radio playing softly in the background. We listen to Wilfred Pickles have a go, with Mabel at the table. Tommy Handley in Itmar, The Diary of a Nobody, The Private Lives of Mrs. Mop, The Will Hay Programme, Monday Night at 8, and Billy Cotton. My father smoked a pipe, and had done so since his 20s. My mother smoked cigarettes. When she started, I never found out. During the war, my mother saved her stubs to roll up later in a machine. Her motto was, make do and mend. Our clothes were, in the main, second-hand, travelling up to London to visit a second-hand clothes shop, my father being the acme of miserliness. Smoking was now accepted for both men and women, the tobacco industry never still promoting their wares, concentrating on attracting women. Most of the films of the period showed both sexes smoking. The Hollywood greats sealed permission for the public in Britain to smoke. I never worked out when my parents had a bath, as our back boiler was temperamental at the best of times. Baths had to be topped up with kettles and buckets of hot water. Newspapers on many occasions were used as a toilet roll. Solid toothpaste kept in a round tin, which we all scrubbed at. My father had no natural teeth, having had them all taken out when he was 20 by a pavement dentist in 1909. It's difficult to imagine how primitive life was at the turn of the century, and the war kept life locked in its basic form. Only 4 inches of bath water allowed during the war, and filling a bath up never shifted the ice built up on the windows in winter. This is a look back to times never to be repeated, to a nation that has pulled itself together to defeat a tyrant, and in the struggle made itself bankrupt. It was also a time when the empire started to crumble, fall apart, never to heal itself from earlier inhuman practices. Today, Black People Matter is recognized necessary to reverse the massive failings throughout the ages, knowing that there are countries where democratic governments are not given a chance to develop by oppressive dictators. Rationing was considered by the government as essential. When writing about history, it is difficult to nail down a particular time or event. There has to be a lead-in, and perhaps I should start now, in 2021, as the country leaves the European community and women's liberation increases, and the start of a time when, just after the First World War, William Beveridge, the liberal economist, urged the government to allow his welfare reforms to become law, to allow reconstruction reforms to help prevent disease, ignorance, poor housing and disorganised labour to exist. Eventually his reforms brought about the National Health Service in 1948. In 1918, only 58% of the male population could vote. The Representation of the People's Act was passed, which allowed women to vote, and it wasn't until 1928 that all women over the age of 21 could do so. Today's voting rights require registration as over 18, as a British or Commonwealth citizen, or as a Republic of Ireland resident. In Wales, Scotland, and for residents and foreign nationals aged over 16 was the necessary age. David Lloyd George, Prime Minister during World War I, took action to promote technical investigations into food preparation, preservation, storage and transport. The outbreak of war in 1939, however, prompted plans for rationing which took place in January 1940 to last until the 50s. The official government leaflets in 1940 promoted fitness for all of its citizens to carry on the fight after Dunkirk, which would need its people to live healthier lives by consuming healthier food, by taking regard of food nutritional worth. During the Great Depression in the 1920s, when unemployment exceeded 2 million, the poorest citizens could just about buy enough calories to stay alive, although unable to buy vegetables, milk and fruit. 10 years later, in 1930, a study was made by the British Medical Association, and they proved that only the richest received a surplus of basic food constituents. The rest of the population went without. Lack of calcium being the greatest problem, which galvanised the government to institute a programme of school milk provision. The outbreak of the 1940s war hastened plans for rationing and distribution. The Ministry of Food was overseen by Lord Woolton, who had seen first-hand the effects of malnutrition and neglect in Liverpool. Sir Jack Drummond, who was the then scientific advisor to the government, was a biochemist. These two men made it their job to improve the nation's diet, and this led to a national food policy that promoted sufficient nourishment and economical use of all food. It was expected that British farmers would be able to supply a third of the nation's food, energy requirements, 2/3 of the calcium and a third of vitamin A, 2/5 of vitamin B and all of C, due to an increase of potato production. It was decided to up the production of milk and vegetables and import dried and condensed milk, canned fish, beans and peas. The supply of foreign fruit was considered wasteful of shipping, but that fruit farming needed to be increased. An emphasis for the production of oilseed rape, oils, fats, canned meats and sugar. Alcohol and cigarettes were never rationed, nor coffee, offal, chicken, rabbit, game, fish, horse meat, corned beef, spam, whale meat or snook. In 1942, a week's ration was 4 ounces of bacon, 1 and twopence worth, meat, 2 ounces, 2 to 4 ounces of cheese, 4 ounces of margarine, 8 ounces of sugar, 1 egg, 5 grams of tea, 2 to 3 pints of milk, 12 ounces of sweets, and every 2 months 1 pound of jam. A survey was carried out to find out what unfamiliar foods were being used, such as dried egg, powdered milk and skimmed milk. In the end, it was decided to have an extensive program of cooking lessons. rationing was introduced in January 1940 with the introduction of a points rationing scheme. Every man, woman and child had a ration book, and food prices were pegged. Everyone was entitled to the same. Households had to register with a local shop who were only delivered sufficient for registered customers. The shopkeeper removed some stamps from the ration book and at other times crossed off that which had been used. I remember there was much in the newspapers about English stoicism, queuing, using the family's ration books for that week's ration, both inside and outside each shop, parking the bike or pram at a distance from its owner without fear that it would be stolen or interfered with. The police were patrolling the streets night and day, looked upon as trustworthy guardians, ever watchful and concerned about anything uncle, like checking every padlocked shop door. The local police sergeant parked his bike and phoned into the police station to make a daily report using the blue telephone boxes. My mother, carrying a shopping bag, would pay a call to the International Stores and Hovis Bakery, owned by Rank Hovis McDougall Limited, and the local butchers. I can imagine her now, in her long coat and hat, gripping her canvas bag, pushing Stan, her firstborn, in the coach-built pram. It is the spring 1935. She is pregnant with me, due to give birth that July. Elsie had not long left Somerset and village life, where she went to school, learnt to work a number of looms, and become a respected lady's maid before the age of 25, to finally live in an ancient abbey with her mistress, to become part of the household staff. Elsie was to marry a man who worked daily within a main railway transportation hub, engaged in packaging, milk delivery, market stall, hustle and bustle. It was Albert's job to organise the marshalling and the harnessing of 600 dray horses and carriages, to deliver within London a variety of materials and objects, having to negotiate through narrow, congested and cobbled streets amid the uproar and filth caused by overcrowding, by the shouting of street sellers, touts, doormen and delivery boys. In 1910, when Albert was 21, he attended a mechanic's shop to be instructed in the maintenance of petrol motors and to learn to drive the first heavy-duty wagons. The object was to be able to pass on his knowledge of motor mechanics to new members of staff, knowing the necessity to maintain such vehicles in the future when horses were no longer required. Albert took it upon himself to drive every new motor to assess its roadworthiness and adaptability. There's no doubt that Albert knew he was an outsider, being employed by Thompson Mackay and not a member of the Transport Union or Railwaymen's Union. He was considered to be a cartage manager of a delivery company, not a railwayman, and therefore unable to apply for Western Railway vacancies. This made him unable to apply for higher managerial work within all the railway companies. This suppression by the Union may have been made because Albert had been against the national strike of 1929 and actively kept work continuing throughout the strike period. The National Union of Railwaymen was founded in 1913, and by the following year the union had joined forces with the National Transport Workers' Federation. It was then, in 1919, the National Union of Railwaymen and ASLEF organised a strike for increased wages, and this became the shortest strike ever, the government maintaining its present wage rates for another year with the union's agreement. The general strike of 1926 included the railwaymen striking to support the miners' union, and within 9 days the dispute had ended. Stanley Baldwin, 1927, Trade Disputes Act bans sympathy strikes forever. It was payment of coal in reparation for the 1914-18 war by Germany, which undercut coal prices that caused the strike. The fear of communism galvanized the government to act quickly. By the end of the 30s, the marriage rate in Britain was the highest it had ever been. The combination of smaller families and higher marriage numbers led to higher expectations, and this provided a major stimulus for the house-building boom of the 30s. In the time span covered, women were still only emancipating themselves from prudery and ignorance. In sexual matters, it was advocated that women were as entitled as men to obtain pleasure and satisfaction from sexual techniques. Guilt, embarrassment, frustration, and unhappiness were common. Male dominance remained within the culture and throughout society to the detriment of the common good. Class structures have remained upper, middle, lower, landed gentry, aristocrat, professor, priest, doctor, manager, foreman, tradesman, worker, clean, all used to denote position, and these titles and others gave a position on the ladder of life, which it was assumed attributed worthwhileness and something to be achieved, driving individuals along to increase production. Women, prior to 1940, have been characteristically employed in unskilled jobs, mainly in trade, cleaning, catering or clerical. It was as if women were second-class citizens who were incapable of skilled, intricate work and not worth educating or training. It was the employment of men in the forces that created vacancies in industry. It was found that eventually women were far better at the less heavy work with a greater dexterity than men in all aspects of industry and manufacture. Albert was at this time a territorial army volunteer since the age of 17 in 1906, making the rank of Lance Corporal. Then, by the time of war in 1914, he was a company sergeant, being accepted into the Kensington Freemasons' Lodge. Later, as warrant officer, a highly decorated regimental sergeant major, as one of the founder members of the Old Contemptibles in 1925. He didn't leave the army until 1990, still retaining his territorial status. By 1932, about to be married, Albert was a man about town. In a man's world, he was getting married to a 27-year-old lady's maid who had never left a Somerset village. The marriage ceremony carried out in the local church before relations, neighbours and friends, to a man totally outside to Elsie's known world. And throughout married life Elsie supported her husband contentedly, staying at home whilst Bert continued to serve his regiment's social life, Freemasons' Lodge, as organist and local Old Contemptible club. Elsie now lived in one of London's green suburbs with her first child, to be pregnant again. Being a housewife must have felt very strange, an out-of-this-world feeling. However, she was contented and happy to be married with a family, even though a member of a male-dominated world. I don't remember any woman or schoolgirl commented on their role in society, nor complained that they were in any way inferior, unfitting, not considered or banned from certain types of work. That they were all of these things, looking back, was obviously detrimental and almost criminal. And just as I accepted my position in society that I would have to work, I accepted without fuss. The same applied to the girls in the class. They too accepted their position and didn't complain that it was not what they wanted. The general consensus was that you were going to get married, buy a house and have children. There were no synagogues, temples, mosques or Catholic churches in North Harrow. Don't remember persons of colour. There were in the borough Cubs, Brownies, Scouts, Girl Guides, Venture Scouts, Boys Brigade, Church Lads Brigade and cadets of all three services. All the above associations were expected to attend church parades and celebrate Empire Day. As I stood at the back door, looking in, my glance rests on the table. It was the place the family met. It served as an ironing board, sometimes a place for jigsaws and board games, where we had those super splendid meals my mother turned out every day. Nothing was wasted, and mother had her own mother's experience behind her, catering for a large family to help her stretch out the food. We bred our own chickens, so we had plenty of eggs, bacon rind saved, as was fatty ends of meat, to lay on the weekend joint, and this contributed to the quality and quantity of the dripping. Fat that was used to make countless numbers of dishes, and the bottom brown jelly perfect to spread on bread with a dash of salt. One pot steamed meals, hot pot, fish stew, Scotch broth, dumplings, toad in the hole, suet crust, summer puddings with stale bread, bread and butter puddings, all look forward to. Thank goodness potatoes contain the same vitamin C as do oranges, so potato water makes excellent soups and gravies, which we had in abundance. School dinners were not just the meal of the day. Both my schools instructed the day's monitor and teacher to circulate the dining tables to make sure all was eaten and nothing wasted. Pupils instructed how to sit and hold their knife, fork and spoon, why they should keep their elbows down and not prop up their chins, not to speak with their mouths full, how to breathe through their nose and why, cough and sneeze in a handkerchief, asked to be excused from the table and to lift up their chairs, not just push them back. These simple points of behaviour resulted in better socialisation and acceptance, and children learnt better watching and listening to others. The 5 years between 1935 and the start of war was a gradual improvement in the labour market, soaking up the unemployed. It took the following 3 years to increase production methods before Britain's mass rearmament took off under the Ministry of Works, Ernest Bevin, becoming able to compete with the Axis forces, including Japan. Worked, directed, shaped and identified individuals. Jobs for men included industry, commerce that led to the field, followed by agriculture, mining, quarrying, refining, vehicle manufacture, weaving and clothing. A third of the workforce were women, 2/3 of which were previously in service. The growth of white-collar workers grew apace in the 30s, in retaining government both local and national. Wholesale and retail distribution, entertainment, sport and personal services were increased massively. In 1935, over half of all workers worked in factories, plants and sheds employing 500 or more. Half of all office workers were working in companies with 26 or less staff, and gradually throughout the 30s the numbers of workers in all workplaces began to expand. There was an urgency and a will to increase production and to grow the business and profits. The Axis forces had begun in the 1930s to invest in weapons. to compete with other European forces in all arms, forms of weaponry, tactics and men having been withheld during the period of peace and unrest after World War I. By the outbreak of war in 1939, they were well ahead and psychologically prepared to engage any European country. The thought of the possibility of war had stirred up the government to put in hand plans for rationing, and by the time declared ration cards had been printed and distributed, the use of the ration card soon became accepted and easily worked as the shopkeepers marked off the goods bought with a pencil. Later on, in the first 2 years of the war, when so many transport ships were being sunk, sufficient imported food was considered unlikely to feed the nation unless a new plan was put into place that would work. The American manufacturer of the long-range Liberator, the British Sunderland, and the Walrus planes patrolled the Atlantic and guarded the coast. The manufacturer of multiple depth-charge projectiles, improved sonar, and revised escort manoeuvres finally defeated the U-boats in late 1943. My mother would cook sufficient meals for the ration to last for 5 evening meals, including the weekends, keeping the dripping in a bowl, comprising of stews, shepherd's or cottage pies, liver and bacon and suet puddings, sausages, corned beef or fish for the remainder of the week. The mincer was clamped to the kitchen table, and it was our job, Stan and I, to turn the handle as Mum fed in the meat, onion, bread and carrots. The taste, I confirm, was so much better than just mince meat. The mixture was used for shepherd's and cottage pie or savoury pie. The government promoted Dig for Britain to make sure people received sufficient vegetables. Chickens, ducks and rabbits were kept. Field, hedge and trees provided fruit, berries, mushrooms and nuts. Saccharine, powdered potato, powdered milk, spam and margarine. It was fortunate that the nation had a Minister of Food, Lord Woolton, whose main aim was to obliterate malnutrition and child neglect. And I can remember Charles Hill, the radio doctor, extolling the use of porridge in such a friendly voice. The answer lay in taking cod liver oil and malt and concentrated orange juice. Keynes' policies in 1941 advised stopping pre-war economic restraints. A far greater increase in government expenditure was begun. An extension of state control led to massive arms production, which eventually crippled the state and exhausted the nation. When my class had sat its 11 plus exam 4 years before, in 1946, at Longfield School, you could look around the class and pick out those few who were likely to pass to a grammar school. The local authority in 1950 had a number of grammar school places which they wished to fill. The numbers of children necessary to fill these school places were provided by local junior schools. The children most likely to benefit from higher learning courses are chosen by examination, and it's patently obvious that there are a number of children who would benefit that have been left out, and some effort was made the following year to give those children a second chance. Headstone Secondary Modern School, Pinner Road, started life in 1929 when the district was expanding to encompass the house building by Cutler and Nash. As the population increased, class sizes kept pace to take in over 40 students during the introductory first year. In World War II, under the headship of Mr. Manson, gradually the school increased its size, taking over the Pinner Annex, a building that provided space to teach art and technical drawing. The main school taught gardening, home economics, metalwork and woodwork, as well as the conventional syllabus. The school uniform of navy blue jacket was introduced in 1946 and is still in use today as the uniform. Comprehensive education believes that this selection is wasteful, that more children can be given the chance to partake of greater facilities and smaller classes. However, this requires a far greater financial resource, which is promised but never fulfilled. What is it then that can be done to help children achieve a higher standard? It has to be assumed that the parents play a big part in their children's successes by giving them home tuition, particularly in their younger years, reading to them, playing adventurous revealing games, teaching basic language and sums, reciting stories, adventures and experiences. Probably the answer lies with the parents more so than the children. If the parents are united in their aim, meaning to help their child as best they can, and are willing to start them off, taking them through their early years, teaching the alphabet, nursery rhymes, counting and reading, half the battle's won. If the parents supplement the school's work by applauding the use of homework, the battle to give their children a good start in life has been made. But the effort and interest must be maintained. 80 years ago the world was a very different place than today. The Labour Party under its leader, Clement Attlee, as Prime Minister, was considered by many the most successful British Prime Minister ever. Attlee improved and enlarged social services, creating the National Health Service whilst nationalising industries and utilities. His reputation was as a blunt, efficient leader, able to make quick, decisive decisions. If only the nation could have relied upon to back his conception of a modern society, we would be a totally different society today. In comparison to today's society, there was very little leisure and recreation. My working hours didn't leave much evening entertainment time. Summer holidays for northern factory workers revolved mainly around well-known coastal venues in the north, when their factories shut down for maintenance. Cheap holidays in the sun, initially in Benidorm, began in 1950. The National Trust was founded in 1895, English Heritage in 1983, and Historic England in 2015. Extended holidays periods have stimulated visits to historic English country houses, parks and gardens, and these parks and buildings claim an increasing band of supporters, finance and interest. My parents, as a united couples, did not at any time discuss or describe to us children what they hoped we would achieve in life, nor did they give us a set of guiding principles, perspectives or best interests to hold on to. They had not even described their own childhoods to give us a glimmer of what they had gone through. So necessary if parents need to guide their children to miss the same pitfalls and to rise above daily traumas. They didn't tell us anything about sex, how babies were a natural expectation, what body parts contributed to procreation, or what the difference was between a vagina and a vulva. As for couples masturbating to achieve a climax in foreplay, sex in all its forms, a banned, if not hidden subject. My father wrote a small piece about his life and school days, praising his last headmaster for taking such a keen interest in his work. This does seem strange, in that my father played little part in my education. You would have thought by his praises that he valued education highly, to the degree that he would pass this interest on to his children. But he didn't. Nor did he take a great deal of interest in my first job, other than to attend my interview with the owners of the firm. They copied past generations' behaviour and fortitude. They were days when you got on with life as best you could, to follow prescribed avenues suitable for your place in society. That all sounds terribly cold and unfeeling, but that is how most couples behaved at the time. Christmas Eve, 1945. Tea in the front room, before a highly decorated tree surrounded by paper chains, balls and bells. The room appears in my mind's eye very little different from the room at the start of the war 5 years before. The decorations the same as the room's furniture, its fire and food laid on the starched tablecloth. This picture remembered all my life. Mum and Dad enjoyed Christmases and passed on their love for the occasion to us children. My father started playing carols on the piano in the next room. My brother Derek, just 2, in his playpen with his toys. The 3 grown-ups were happy. Mum and Nan talkative and excited. The war now ended, the house aglow with lights and goodwill. Stan out with his friends. I at my father's side, turning over the music and selecting the pieces. Chapter 2. Last Days at School. June 1950. The scene. A 1950s classroom. A gramophone plays. The desks are pulled back. The class shuffles about in a horseshoe within the desks. A general feeling of embarrassment. It all seemed quite unreal. We all knew our school days were going to come to an end at some point. Well, here it was. School was now over, and for 6 months I'd been painting a picture with Michael Gilbert of the Pinner School Annex. Now it was finished, and I felt unattached. It was all rather unreal. I looked around at the class. They were all 15-year-olds about. They appeared to be adults, no longer children. Our teacher had acquired a gramophone. She put on a popular waltz. The socially adept dance buffs asked the girls for a dance. They appeared to glide round the space allowed by the desks being pushed back. We, the unpolished outcasts, looked on enviously, and as a group we were all jealous. There was little point in remaining. I knew then that I was going to have to learn to dance. I walked slowly home, this time on my own, past the shops and cinema, to turn left at the crossroads. I had left secondary school with a school prize for technical drawing tucked under my arm. My classmates had scattered before the wind. It was now up to me. I was going to have to work many things out for myself. My parents had not prepared me for my future. How could they? My father, a 61-year-old Victorian, who was mentally captured by his experiences during World War I. My mother, a 42-year-old ex-lace mill worker from a country village in Somerset, had never stepped outside her own village boundary. Now she was married with 2 boys in a suburban London town. School curriculums were beginning to change to concentrate on academic subjects rather than subjects allied to work. And educational reforms meant more options, the possibilities to increase your learning beyond school leaving age at 14, the national school leaving age. The 1936 Education Act raised that to 15. Exceptions could be made for families where children were required to work to help support the family, on the land or where at sea. It was 1950, 4 years after World War II. The Berlin blockade, started in 1948-9, had ended and the Korean War just started. Britain saw everything on the television in black and white, there being only BBC One, a TV station started in 1946 with limited watching time. We never had a television until 10 years later. I was 15, unattached, completely ignorant about human relationships, never seriously kissed a girl. The acceptance that everyone went to work to earn money was embedded in my soul, and some of my friends went on to polytechnics or further educational colleges, but not me. It was easy to recall attending my interview at Chromaworks and the excitement the letter had caused, setting the date. My father and I journeyed to the factory. First I had to attend a meeting with the firm's managing director that seemed to go down quite well. My portfolio got them all nodding and smiling. The firm's secretary produced the indenture to be signed by all parties as the official-looking form was handed round. The meeting, at last, was over, and we set off back home. My brain was in a whirl as the miles clattered by. My interview and acceptance to my first job had been made a month before, and next Monday I had to take the Metropolitan line train to Wembley, walk over the platform to get on a Bakerloo line train to Neasden, and then walk the rest of the way to Willesden. Before this moment my main concerns had been with school, my friend David Villas, and the Boys' Brigade. Now my allegiances were about to change. Skills training was going to take over. I knew that my national service was going to interrupt my apprenticeship, and that I had no option but to either defer or start national service at 18. The Boys' Brigade would still be attended up to my 17th birthday. You might think I was nervous walking away from the train station, not knowing what to expect from the men or the work. My father had bought me a season ticket as a present. Now my journeys were going to be a daily routine, so I'd better get used to it. I was excited, keen to get on with my tasks, whatever they might turn out to be. And you might think I would be wishing that I'd never started the journey. But I wasn't. I was keen to get on with it, to grow up. I walked down Leesden Lane in 1950 with a spring in my step, still 14, a few days before my 15th birthday, looking around at the sights, although having seen them all a month before, they had remained a total blur in my memory. It was amazing that the population had easily slipped back into normal working life after 5 years of war, the main difference being that there were more women on the train, and walking down the road, women were now to become integrated into the men's one-time preserve. It's difficult to imagine my thoughts and feelings at the time. I was pretty innocent. There was no going back. Here I was marching down the road, humming Christian Soldiers, onward they went, The hymn stuck in my brain as I strode out. There was little sign of war damage. The people jostling along were mainly factory and shop workers having to clock in at 8 o'clock. What was I experienced was for real. The crowd of workers on and off the pavement beside the railings that divided them from the railway sidings, and the hoardings lower down the hill proclaiming Tetley's tea. Most of those workers of both sexes wore a dark blue or black raincoat, giving the sight a sort of L.S. Lowry feeling. And round the corner opposite Park Ward, there perched next to Dalmayer Limited and behind British Thompson Houston, sat Cromer Works, behind a tall wire fence. I was going to be apprenticed for 5 years to Cromer Works in their lithographic artist department. I had promised to attend 2 evening classes, typography and life drawing, and a day and an evening class at Bolt Court, London School of Printing, Fleet Street. My pay was to be 37 shillings and sixpence per week, to rise to 2 guineas after 3 months, if I proved to be a suitable candidate. And thereafter my pay was increased as a percentage yearly. My hours were 48.5 hours per week, including half days on Saturdays. My instructions were to submit my acceptance letter at the gate, find my way to the artist room and introduce myself to the foreman, Mr. Brian Porter. The event flashed through my mind as I approached the factory gate. I blinked and refocused to concentrate on what was before me. Cromer Works was a general lithographic printer of greetings cards, posters, labels, cardboard boxes and metal plates for tins. It was a well-established, profitable business with its own plate grainers, electricians, engineers and maintenance staff. It had continued running throughout the war. A car park to its front was contained within a tall wire fence. I approached the gate. A portly gatekeeper stared at me, asking, "What do you want?" I proffered my letter. He stared at it and beckoned me in. I asked about the artist department. "Just keep walking, down to the bottom of the corridor, you can't miss it." I had made it so far I might as well continue. This was the start to my working life. It was all very Dickensian. Reproducing copies made when symbols or pictures were carved in wood left a raised image to be inked in and transferred to paper or material by contact, a process called letterpress printing. Wood gave way to metal and a carved scratch line in the form of pictures, becoming copperplate or steel engravings. Typesetting progressed to hot press letter form and pictures to halftone mounted on a block. Other forms of reproduction, gravure, screen process and lithography, took their place according to substrate, quality, size and run. I started my apprenticeship not knowing printing technology was to go into rapid decline, brought about by electronic computers, scanners and inkjet printing. Still, that was all to come. My first task that first day, thereafter every day, was to mix up the drawing ink for the men, and to fetch from the canteen the cheese rolls and tea in a jug, which they all enjoyed. The firm was owned by the Oppenheimers, Frank and Arthur. Frank Devereux, the general manager who ran the business with the help of a machine shop overseer. The firm's main contracts was with the Heinz Food Company, producing their labels. Lithography used the repellent qualities of greasy ink to water, which allowed the non-image areas to be dampened and the image areas inked as printed copies were pulled. It was the artist's job to reproduce the original exactly, including any lettering. Coloured artworks were reproduced by overprinting at least 7 colours: buff, yellow, red, blue, black, pink and grey. The printed surface was originally polished Kelheim stone used by Senefelder, 1771 to 1834. He discovered the process. Chromaworks still used a stone image which I had to repair to pull damp-proof transfers for step and repeat work. My daily task was rubbing a stick of black greasy wax on a dinner plate, then using a drop of distilled water to rub, in circular movements with my middle finger, the water to make a black ink, passing out the ink to each artist to fill their tiny pots, usually a thimble pressed into a large threaded nut. This early morning task allowed me to circulate the room, to see what was going on and to acclimatise myself ready for the next task. I quickly became used on production work, creating a key for the colours to be drawn. The operations needed to complete a poster reproduction were a normal 16-sheet coloured poster measured at 20 by 30 inches, assessed for the number of printing necessary to make a commercial reproduction, usually 8 overprinted colours. Each of these colours have to fit, overprint each other in register to build up the picture accurately with the necessary overlaps and trims. The artwork is first traced onto an overlaid Dakota trace sheet using a pen and Indian ink. The tracing is then photographed onto a photographic glass plate to allow enlargement onto paper using a projector. And this was then outlined in black charcoal pencil. This is now outlined, rubbed down onto a zinc printing plate. The outline overdrawn using a pen and greasy black drawing ink, and then the printing plate with outlined black image rolled up and greasy black pool made on paper that's dusted with purple offset powder. This key sheet is passed through a press in contact with as many printing plates as there are colours to be overprinted. With black lithographic crayon and ink, each of these printing plates were drawn to show, by weight of crayon and solid ink, how much of that colour is to be printed. This procedure is followed for each colour on each sheet of paper. If this is for a 16-sheet poster using 8 colours, and that's 32 printings. The poster size could be multiples of one sheet, also referred to as a double crown. There were 5 journeymen, 3 ex-servicemen, which included the foreman, the previous foreman and the new journeyman, who had just completed his apprenticeship. They were all welcoming, helpful, and became lasting friends. Looking back, the department was efficient and the men all skilled artists. I was in my element. It was about this time that artwork was being received to advertise the British Festival of Britain in 1951 to be held on the South Bank. The only evidence still there today is the festival hall. The dome and skylon were also unique constructions being finally removed. Chapter 3. Parents. I continue to sit with my eyes closed, casting my mind back further away from work to see if I could remember more detail, especially to my early life at home. I picture myself standing at the back door of 31 Cumberland Road, opening the door to look in. It is the kitchen, the meeting place for the whole family on so many occasions throughout all those years I lived there. So many incidents to capture, so many tears and shouts of glee, such intimacy and drama. The main feeling was one of sadness. There was so much I wanted to know about my parents, innermost thoughts, for neither my parents talked of their childhoods or what they thought about their own parents. My reminiscences don't have to begin in the kitchen, even though the kitchen was where the family spent 90% of its waking time. But my thoughts do have to have a starting off place, and the front door would make my thoughts unnatural. It was a rare occasion for us boys to come in or go out using the front door. My mind continued to wander, picking up a glimpse of my parents. In the photograph, Bert, about 13 years old, is last on the right of the third row. Lillian, his sister, aged about 12, is next to him. Bert is wearing a black armband, and this may be in mourning for their grandmother, Martha Sutton, schoolteacher, 1878, who died that year. My father wrote this small piece about his schooling. We moved again to Paddington, where I went to school of the London School Board in Amberley Road, Harrow Road. I still have a great affection for that school. The headmaster, Mr. Williamson, was a kind but strict man, and the teachers appeared to be capable and efficient. There were 6 classrooms, and when I left school I could master the 3 R's. I knew a little French, which stood me well in the First World War, and we were taught elementary algebra, composition, drawing, woodwork, and altogether we had a most comprehensive curriculum of learning. I never forgot this school. I can cast my mind back to those dreary days when in the autumn and winter months, when it began to get dark, the teacher lit the gas brackets. This produced a miserable yellow flame which hardly penetrated the gloom and often fog which prevailed in London in those days. One thing I always remember is that we started each day with religious instruction. We had to learn parts of the Bible by heart. We also had prayers and hymns at the end of each day, and we sang our closing hymn and recited our prayers. We too were taught to respect our older people, take off our caps to masters and lady teachers, to say sir when spoken to, and generally to observe those courtesies which in these days are ignored. Our spelling, compared to the scholar of today, was of the highest order. We had to write properly and legibly in copper plate, which was the standard. I left the school to work for Thompson Mackay's and Co., carting agents to the Grand Central Railway when I was 15 in 1904. Bert was a member of the 6th Company London Boys Brigade, leaving to become a member of the Territorials, joining the Kensingtons, the Greys, becoming a lance corporal by 1913. My parents had met at a Masonic dinner dance in 1932. The Freemasons was my father's main hobby, coming second only to the old Contemptibles, chums formed in 1925. In 1932 he was Kensington's Lodge Grand Master, whose task was to organise the annual ladies' dinner dance, the main invitation going out to Mrs. Roper of Ford Abbey, who took along her lady's maid, my mother, who was aged 27. My mother's previous job was as a lace hand at Perry Street Mill, South Chard, being there for 10 years. The watermill is still there, and the factory is still working. Throughout the ages, lace has either been in fashion or not. Lace curtains considered things of beauty or a confounded nuisance. During the war, the mill concentrated on making parachutes. It was my father's task to dance with the lady guests who were not accompanied, and he obviously did a splendid job with my mother, marrying her a year later and having their first son, Stanley, a year after that. I assumed that they were both desperate to settle down, create a family, and live happily ever after. I don't think there was anything else pressing them forward. However, what I'm sure about is they were both supremely happy and were loving every moment of it. They weren't concerned nor affected by what was going on in the rest of the world, nor worried about their age differences. This, unfortunately, was the time of the Great Depression, which concerned the whole world, a time when nearly 10 million Ukrainians died of starvation. In Germany, Hitler signed a non-aggression pact with Poland, and in England there were hunger marches by the unemployed and celebrations by those in work, cheering the silver jubilee of King George V. A year later he died, and the eldest son later abdicated. Massive unemployment led to the march from Jarrow to Westminster by workers in protest against inequalities. The world was in turmoil. My father maintained an opinion that it was unwise to own a property, that individuals should rent, leaving the upkeep to the owner. Now this was a fine philosophy if the money saved is properly invested to cushion eviction or old age. My father's job as cottage manager was relatively safe and quite well paid. When he died, after the death of my mother, he had nothing to leave except his medals and swords. The centuries-old Irish clan family tradition held that all first sons should be named Thomas. The tradition had been maintained by Thomas Carey of Fore, County Westmeath, a branch of Cahill O'Connell. His ancestor Thomas Braintree was killed by the Cromwellians at the burning of the Abbey in 1654, and his son Thomas married Mary O'Brien. It was their son, Thomas, who died in Spain in 1700. By 1660, the Catholics were only allowed to own land to the west of the River Shannon, in the province of Connaught and the county of Clare. It was the time of the flight of the Earls, which allowed plantations to follow. It was certainly the time the clan O'Carey split apart forever. The family still existed through brother Hugh, who married Margaret, and their son Thomas Patrick married Julia. Their eldest son Thomas married Mary Keir, who died in Dublin in 1836. Now he was the first to omit the O and assume the English translation Keary, K-E-A-R-Y. Thomas Carey, 1791 to 1860, further anglicised his name by adding E. It was his eldest son, Thomas, who continued the tradition, naming his eldest son Thomas too. Now his eldest, after the death of William, was Alfred, whose own son Thomas died in his first year. It can be assumed that Alfred, my grandfather, understood sufficiently to follow the tradition. Brothers Alfred, Frederick, Walter and Sidney were all killed in World War I, childless, leaving my father as head of the family, with his own eldest son he named Stanley Edward, obviously not following the old Irish tradition. Ireland and the Irish never spoken about, as if it bore absolutely no relevance to him whatsoever, nor to the family. This, I believe, very sad. I was never to find out if my father knew or understood the significance or connection. All I do know is that World War I affected the family, particularly Albert. From my father's position close to the officers receiving commands, he recognised the stupidity of the orders, but could do nothing about altering them other than making sure his men were protected and given maximum support. It was his Distinguished Conduct Medal and 2 mentions in dispatches which bear witness to his efforts to look after his men. Here I am 100 years later, imagining how my father survived the First World War, and then trying to understand how the printing industry kept going through the various mechanical, electrical and programmable productions of words and pictures, now to allow this memoir to be sent across the world. Our kitchen, throughout the war and afterwards, was the hub and the wheels of the family, its heart and soul, where breakfast, dinner and teas prepared and eaten, home to the cat's bowl and the room where the wireless played all day. Having a cat was for my mother an obligatory companion, and therefore the scene I'm painting wouldn't be complete without a cat. As for the radio, it introduced the family to each morning, took us through each day to finally bid us good night. The station selector never moved. Breakfast was cornflakes for summers, porridge for winters, a full English breakfast for Sundays, and boiled eggs and soldiers Saturdays. Kippers and smoked haddock, a special tea obligatory at all times, camp coffee rarely made, Christmas the only time for a glass of English sherry or port. As a treat, Stan and I might be handed a toasting fork and a crumpet or slice of bread to toast by the kitchen fire, or Mother may have placed a potato in the ash can under the fire to bake. It was fun as we gathered round the fire with our own personal knob of margarine in the evenings, listening to Tommy Handley and Itmar. On occasions in late October, early November, Dad would buy a bag of chestnuts, and these he would slit with his penknife and roast on the coal shovel to be dealt out later, for each of us to juggle with, to make cool enough to peel off the skin and eat. It's not difficult to understand how much my father enjoyed those moments completely. Everyone happy, no demands for attention. My father would also buy a pint of winkles for tea. Pins had to be found to be bent, to enable us to draw out the winkle, to have with a slice of buttered bread. My mother did not divulge intimate thoughts or worries, nor did she pamper or hold us boys close. She wrote to her relatives infrequently, maintaining a set of habits that gave her contentment. She could be described as self-contained. I never saw my parents kiss, hold hands, touch each other with affection, or to mention how they felt. I never heard my parents ever discuss world affairs, the state of the economy, what they were planning for old age, or what they might leave in their will. Nor do I remember either of them complaining. When both her parents had died, by 1953, Rosalie Cottage was put on the market. Elsie was sent a letter inviting her to buy the cottage for £200. This was just after the war. My parents turned down the offer. In 1959, when my father was 70, he wrote to the Secretary of the Freemasons to ask if he and his wife qualified for assistance for living accommodation. Dad had just received notification that the owner of 31 Cumberland Road had died and that the new owner was putting the property on the market. Two Freemasons arrived to discuss the matter with my father, the outcome being they believed he did not qualify, and as a result he applied to the Harrow Council and was allocated a flat in Pinner Green that was under construction. I was shocked to see later his piano being broken up in time for the removals to take the rest of the furniture to Pinner. Later in life, Mum attended the Church of Christian Science, taking the bus there on her own. She invited me on occasions to go with her to the cinema. It was a treat I enjoyed. If that all sounds a bit weird, it wasn't really. It was most comforting. The Collins of Chard have been traced back to George Collins of 1780, who married Sarah Spence. The dates of deaths in the Collins family are scarce. They had 4 children. John, 1801, married Mary and had 8 children. Philip, 1847 to 1900, married another Mary, having 5 children. School Lane, Tatworth, the school behind the wall, faces Rosalie Cottage. St Margaret's Lane, a little further on the right. The ford at the dip in the road allows the mill stream to pass over, and below the school a plot of land where Aunt Ivy and husband Ken lived. My grandmother, Rosa Jane Collins, born in Chard in 1872 to Robert and May Beavis of Axminster, married Philip Alfred Henry Collins of 1870 to 1945, who was nicknamed Harry. He was a lace engineer in 1891 in Tatworth at St John the Evangelist Church. They lived in Rosalie Cottage, named after Rosa, which was specially built for them and an aunt during their engagement. The stone garden wall circled the house and gardens with their chicken runs, isolating the terraced house against the high bank and mill stream from the field beyond, its left hand facing Tatworth School and right side the bottom of St Margaret's Lane and the blacksmith's forge. My grandparents had 16 children, 2 of which were twins who died at birth. My mother, Elsie, was the 11th child. 5 of the children died within 4 years of birth. Throughout the ages, many of the remaining children became connected to the local mill and lace industry. All the children attended Tatworth School in Perry Street, School Lane. The Collins family before Harry, 21, and Rosa, 23, married, had all lived in Chard and been associated with the making of plain net. From the 16th century, manufacturing woolen cloth had been Chard's sole industry. It was in 1821 that plain net began to be made in Mill Lane, Chard. The first actual lace factory was opened by John Wheatley and John Rist. Lace manufacturing continued until 1938. The upper mill, first owned by Wheatley, Sparks and Co., then James Hill, and finally the Gifford family, owning Holyrood Mill for 3 generations. The Perry Street Lace Mill, South Chard, is 3 miles south of Chard, trading as G. W. Cuff in 1830. By 1844 to 1891, when John Small took control until 1988. The property was leased to John Bellamy Payne from 1844 till 1891. The lace trade has disappeared from Chard, but still continued in the Perry Street works, considering by some to be the largest concentration of lace machines making plain net in the world using nylon. My grandfather, Philip Alfred Collins, 1847 to 1900, was head lace hand working for John Small. He married Mary Jane Webb, 1843-1890, and finally married widow Susan Hoskins, née England, in 1895. Much of his time there, Philip ran the mill with John Small, whilst Payne continued to engage in designing multiple patents.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
Chapter 4. Wartime. Having had my train of thought momentarily distracted by flashbacks to Chard, I reach out for North Harrow and family life. Invitations to dinner at 31 were scarce. The list is short. Stan, Bowling Green keeper, Keeley, a friend from the trenches, and Rose, his wife, who took me to the BBC to audition for Just William, and daughter Christine. My father's brother Will, paint and varnish chemist, and wives Hazel, who died of blood poisoning, and second wife Mary, adopted Aunt Amy. These are the only permanent outside-the-home friends and relatives to visit us. They were people who were from my father's past, not my mother's. She was befriended only by our adopted aunt Nan, and my mum's sister Vera, and one or two infrequent neighbours. My brothers and I sought our friendships away from Cumberland Road, not inviting anyone back. To a degree, I followed my elder brother to schools and pin a teenagers' club. My closest friend, David Henry Villas from Northumberland Road, stayed my friend from the age of 5 till 17 on an almost daily basis. National service and work began severing these connecting years. My brother Derek was about 10 in 1953, when I had been at work for 3 years, coming up to national service. Stan had deferred his entry, was working at Dagenham Motors. My father never went to the pictures, theatre, or socialised locally, except to sit and listen to the music played in the park in the summer. It was the music he loved and played himself, casting his mind back to his military past and Victorian upbringing. Perhaps his reticence was because of his bad hearing, but I don't think so. It was more that he felt apart from those that attended, feeling that such amusements trivial to his serious-mindedness. He preferred to read a book before the fire, and there was no doubt that he loved playing the piano, and was very good at it too. giving each piece feeling and atmosphere. He invited me to attend an evening with him and his fellow contemptibles at a pub in Harrow. I was to be in uniform. I felt completely lost and distant, a strange feeling of not really being present. I felt out of place. They were all so much older. Father's political convictions were conservative. He distrusted his fellow man as unreliable, believing individuals should look after themselves whilst caring for those who are unable. Secondly, his experiences during World War I convinced him that he was being led by incompetent fools, which he could do very little about other than look after those men closest to him, those of his platoon, and finally of his battalion as regimental sergeant major. I'm sure my father carried the experiences with him every second of the day, obliterating everything else. When he went to war in 1914, he was the fifth boy born to the family. The eldest had died in 1882, leaving him third in line, and by the end of the war these three brothers had all been killed, leaving him as head of the family, a position totally unexpected. Today's horror stories are about refugees seeking a new home, wandering from camp to camp, chased away by those already there. So much for the Christmas spirit, or being a good Samaritan. Bert didn't make allowances. Having started the war as a devout Christian, he witnessed the slaughter and the injuries. This was an in-your-face horror for him, which convinced him there was no God. Losing 4 brothers, his mother and his mother's Martha wore their medals on alternate days for the rest of her life. She, however, always read and carried her Bible, never to lose her faith. Bert did not make allowances. Having started the war as a devout Christian, he witnessed the slaughter and the injuries. This was an in-your-face horror. Albert's job with London North Eastern Railway, mainline station Marylebone, as cartage manager, tested his command and control of delivery men and their willingness to work. During the general strike, he did his best to undermine the strikers, making deliveries himself and organising the service to break the strike at every occasion. He would have been disliked by his union officials. His insistence that you're paid to do a job fell on deaf ears. Dad's dislike for trade unionism and trade unions was, I'm sure, their link to Russia and communism. In the Second World War, it was his full-time job to command and organise, as Major of the 17th London Division Home Guard, his troops to defend London from the north, based upon Epping Forest. In the early days of the war, it was German paratroopers who were considered the most likely to land, and parachutists from shot-down planes. Later, it was to be prepared to fight an invading army coming from the south. I'm sure he did his job perfectly well, and as an organiser, he was without peer. I continued to stand and look into the kitchen from the back door, my mind full of happenings being played out before me. Mother doing the ironing, the flat irons warming on the gas stove, pulling up the cloths to take up the airing cupboard in the bathroom, her corn killing her as she came down to stick her feet in the washing up bowl taken from underneath the sink as she knitted another couple of rows. My elder brother and I had our lunches, dinners, at school, leaving Mum with just a tea to provide once we had arrived home. Sandwiches of golden syrup, marmalade, jam, banana, marmite, sandwich spreads, perhaps salted dripping from Sunday's roast. The loaf did not last long before we were both out again with our friends. Dad had his dinner at 6 o'clock, having his plate heated up over a pan of boiling water. He sat at the kitchen table, looking up occasionally to look out of the back door. I see his face. How at ease he looks. I see the clothes there are pulled up close to the ceiling. All is quiet except the radio, a large dark wood fretted box with 2 control knobs and a station selector always tuned to the home service. It was playing a popular song, perhaps Run Rabbit Run or We'll Meet Again. The radio's aerial having to stretch from the kitchen window to the end of the garden shed to boost the signal. Amazingly, we never had to change or buy a valve or seek an engineer. What would have happened if lightning had struck the aerial? I can only imagine. The sky is blue, cloudless and empty. No aircraft trails visible. Workers down the road are building a brick windowless shelter with a flat, reinforced concrete roof at least 8 inches thick. The street outside is empty. No cars, no children playing, no mothers pushing coach-built prams. The milkman's horse and cart passed half an hour ago. My brother and I were at school, chanting our times tables in front of our year's teacher, he being 1 year older than I. There had been no air raid sirens. If one did go off, life continued at home with what we were doing. If at school, we would have marched class by class into the half-buried underground shelters on the school playing field, there to play as many games and sing as many songs the teachers could think of to entertain us children. There was no panic, no crying. It was orderly and practiced many times. And to us children it was exciting, breaking up the monotony of lessons and a chance to play cat's cradle or lark about. Circling German bombers could be seen and heard, recognizable by their unsynchronized engines. Dogfights between RAF Spitfires and Luftwaffe circled above. During breaks, lunches and going home, my brother and I kept to our separate ways, by preference, to play and be with our own friends. The school's playground had the girls playing hopscotch, skipping or doing handstands against the school walls, the boys playing marbles, flicking cigarette cards or getting nearest to the wall, tag or piggyback fights, 5 stones and marbles. Who was to start first or eliminated from any game decided by fists, tapping another's, intoning 1 potato, 2 potato, 3 potato, 4 and so on. And OUT spells out, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all good children go to heaven, penny on the water, 2pence on the sea, 3pence on the roundabout, and out goes he or she. Chapter 5. Cumberland Road. My mind flickered back to the home time bell and the rush to the school gates. I was going home to Cumberland Road, which lies just off North Harrow's main crossroads, where the three banks proudly hide behind their porticos, built to display their wealth and importance. The town is approximately 15 miles to the west of the capital, London, and between the crossroads and Cumberland Road sits St Andrew's Girls' Infant School, behind the 2:30 bus stop on Station Road, which links the town of Wealdstone and Rayners Lane. It was in fact a dormitory town, with its workers, mainly men, going up to town, which of course was London. The town's ABC cinema, built in the 30s, on Pinner Road, also hugged the crossroads, with the 183 and the Green Line bus stop outside its front doors. The cinema faced Murray's Sweet Shop, Cooper's Hardware Store, Boots the Chemist, W.H. Smith's, McFissery's and Home and Colonial, and to its left, facing, an entrance to its car park right next to the United Dairies, a bookshop, sweet shop, and finally to the corner of Canterbury Road, and another entrance to the cinema's car park, and all together they formed an important island in the centre of town. The imposing wide-fronted cinema had a number of glass-fronted boards displaying photographs of the film of the week. Tickets were sold according to distance from the screen or balcony, at 2 and 3, 1 and 9, or 1 and 3pence. Films were rated A or B, A being the premier film, with adult ratings B, usually a lesser serious film, and A and B shown separately by Pathé News and a cartoon. A time when ice creams were sold by an usherette for a penny a cornet, 3pence a wafer, and 6pence for a wrapped chocolate-covered wafer. A high percentage of the audience smoked, so the atmosphere was thick, punctuated only by the projector's light and usherette's torch. An overflow was allowed to stand behind the rear seats, where the courting couples sat. Highly rated films could be foretold by the length of the queues outside. The expectant film-goers queued behind their price stands stretched round the cinema. Premier cinemas like the Granada in Harrow had an organ, perhaps a comedian, and a band for special events. The commissionaire was dressed in ornate uniform, as were the usherettes. Interiorly, cinemas were fully carpeted, mostly fashioned in the arts and crafts style, and decorated very much like theatres. 4 of us boys decided to go to the pictures without paying, giving what little money we had to one of us to enable him to go in legally. Once there, to wait for an appropriate moment in the dark, when he could leave his seat and pretend to go to the toilets, letting the rest of us in by the exit door. Films will not only inform people of happenings round the world, they introduced new gadgets, machines, ways of working and fashion. Celebrities gave a model to aspire to, of speech, behaviour and attitude to difficulties and hardships. The cinema was school for the masses, opening up new horizons, countries and continents. Overall society grew, becoming inclusive and more fair. However, the so-called British culture still remained subservient to age-old traditions, some quaint and theatrical, and others downright dictatorial and primitive. It remains difficult to imagine the royal family or nobility lasting to see the community living on the moon. Harrow Borough Council installed a number of air raid shelters. Cumberland Road had one, built in 1940, a solid brick affair, without windows or doors, with an 8-inch reinforced concrete flat roof. This unsightly wartime blockhouse was built at the start of the road, opposite St Andrew's School. It had a short life, being removed within its first 2 years of life. It was found that there was a design fault. If a bomb dropped close by, the walls blew out by suction, and the reinforced concrete roof, staying whole, fell in, crushing all those inside. It was never replaced. 2 further buildings were erected at the same time, a British restaurant and home guard hut, both accessed from Station Road, immediately opposite a woodyard and shop. The restaurant built in line with the road close upon the pavement. British restaurants, quick to build government buildings, were constructed of partitioned concrete sections, giving a kitchen and eating area. And these restaurant buildings were provided in a number of towns at the start of the war to provide cheap food for bombed out citizens and people who had used up their ration coupons and were hungry. It also catered for those who were elderly and infirm who couldn't cook for themselves. In the evenings, these buildings provided adequate room for meetings, dances, classes and information lectures. And I was one such individual who at the age of 16 enrolled for classes for old-time dancing. The Home Guard hut was constructed in 1940 next to the British restaurant to house and train a Home Guard contingent and give space for military lectures and meetings. It had its own cooking area, and it was David Villa's father who was the permanent staff throughout the war. All the ammunition, flares and grenades were held in a secure locked corrugated iron hut in the middle of Streamside Walk Gardens, sufficient distance away from residential houses. As you walk down Cumberland Road, you pass on your left the site where the Doodlebug dropped, pilotless vengeance bomb, demolishing at least 5 houses, shattering 10 more, requiring almost total rebuilds. The bomb blinding Robin Salter and injuring many others. During the reconstruction, the remaining houses were encased in scaffolding made of pine poles, creating a magnificent play area where our gang battled with those from Canterbury Road, giving us lad a frame to climb up and pole to slide down, tiles to skim across the site, and bricks to build a gang hut. Continuing down Cumberland Road, a little way further on from the air raid shelter, the North Harrow Tennis Club hidden down a narrow path next to Mrs. Smithers' house. Dad had to lift up the oxygen cylinders into her bedroom for her to read to be able to breathe. He also was called upon by neighbours to kill their chickens by wringing their necks and slitting their throats. Halfway down the road, on the bend, can be seen opposite number 31 a line of 4 wooden door garages standing back from the pavement. The nearest held Dad's wartime loaned Austin 14, and in the winter hot water had to be poured on the windscreen to clear the ice, and the engine only started with the handle, whilst father raced round to juggle with the choke. North Harrow's townfolk in 1940 went about their business with studied calm, determined to preserve their daily routines, whilst mothers pushed prams, queuing became natural, and a gas mask hung around their shoulders. When ration books had to be offered to the shop owner, there was a variety of wallets and containers wrapped around the ration book, giving them individuality. Animated neighbours talked in small groups of the latest happenings outside. House deliveries made by horse and cart, gypsies also called selling pegs, and the policeman patrolled his patch. This quest for normality was the quiet before the storm. At home we children played in the road, hopscotch and catch, until called in to eat. Dad brought in from the garden shed the iron cobbler's shoe repair last to cover our shoe soles with blakies and studs to make our shoe leathers last as long as possible. The metal studs giving us superb sliding footwear that sparkled on the pavement and allowed the agile to clog dance. The kitchen still remains clearest in my memory, formed over a 23-year period. It was 10 foot square, key to my heart, safe, secure and warm, blessed with a life of its own, given by my parents who abided by the Boys' Brigade motto, sure and steadfast. And it was scruffy, unchanging, but welcoming. Held all that one needed to bless one's day, including my father's pipe rack, the letter rack, the latest newspaper map of the Army's progress was stuck upon the wall. The mantelpiece held the obligatory biscuit tin, candlestick, and one could never be sure the lights might go out. The French clock obtained by my father from France during the First World War, a pincushion, my mother's cigarettes, and a tiny chest of drawers full of tacks, paper clips, stamps and hair grips. Hanging from the underside a line to dry the tea towel. I continued to look into the room from my vantage point at the back door. My eyes travelled from the mantelpiece back to the door post, past the hot water pipes leading to the ceiling and the draining board with mirror above, to rest at the butler's sink, the shelves above and below holding the washing up bowl. My eyes returned back to the mantelpiece, there glanced down to the fireplace which holds the back boiler and oven above. The back boiler was designed to heat cold water in a series of pipes at the back of the boiler. Hence back boiler. The cold water in the downpipe flows from the hot tank in the bathroom to the back of the boiler. The fire heats the water in the pipes at the back, which causes hot water to rise in the up pipe to the tank, entering the hot water tank. The cold water falls to the bottom of the tank, back down to the fire to restart the operation again. This is a continuous operation as long as there's water in the tank and the fire is lit. And this method of heating water is fine if the pipes carrying the cold water at the back of the fire are bare and clear of cinders and unburnt rubbish, and the lid of the fire remains closed, forcing all the superheat to pass past the pipes to heat the water. The system fails miserably if the lid of the fire is left open, and then the room gets hot and the water remains cold. Opposite the fireplace, the table against the wall on the left, next to the oven and window, and straight ahead the door leading to the hall. In the middle of the back wall, the dresser next to the broom cupboard that held the shoe cleaning gear, and in the corner the walls and door painted light mustard and the ceiling whitewashed. The centre light shone dimly under a simple white shade, revealing my father washing and shaving there, the family's clothes boiling on the gas stove, and our overfilled toy cupboard boxed in under the dresser's profuse hooked up cups and piled up saucers. 2 chairs placed in front of the dresser, one folded, the other positioned next to the fire for my mother's daily use. My father's batch of canes, including his officer's baton, used to enforce discipline, kept in the shelf bracket beneath the radio. Father's second job, summer or winter, was to light the highly inefficient back boiler, the only means to warm the kitchen and the water. The handful of kindling and logs left overnight to dry in the hearth lit the anthracite coal fire, which lasted, when burnt coal was replaced, for the rest of the day. It was always wise, though, not to let the fire burn down too low, for fear of it going out. I look hard and just make out the edges of the lino showing under the rather bedraggled, threadbare Indian carpet. On the same wall as the back door was the kitchen's only window, a cafe-high lace curtain de rigueur copied all other windows. And below the window the gas stove with brass taps. Bolted onto the back of the stove a metal frame held a necessary shelf at head height, beneath which 4 hob burners and optional toaster. The oven was the most perfect household gadget, producing an enormous variety of meals. The kitchen table was the family's eating table and ironing board, taking up most of the side wall under the shelf holding the radio. It was very rare that Mum had to use a recipe book. Mother's bow-backed nursing chair, placed in front of the dresser next to the fender and fire guard, opposite the garden door, and this was her station during the day, when the rest of the family was out. Minnie the cat curled up at her feet. It was this picture I recall. Mother in her pinafore, sitting, plying her needles, knitting socks or stitching her embroidered tablecloth, the back door open, letting in the light, giving a view of the wooden shed and garden beyond. She's listening to Mother, Listen with Mother, played on the radio, a cigarette firmly clamped between her lips, tilting her head to one side. It allowed the smoke to make its way up to the ceiling, broken only by the gust of wind from the open door. The sunlight streams in, and this picture could be from a film from the past, but it isn't, for you see, it was as clear as day. Whereas memories of my mother were closely linked to the kitchen, I linked my father with memories of the sitting room. This room was chosen by my parents as the second warmest room in the house, next to the kitchen at the back, its French doors opening out onto the garden. It was the room occupied every weekend as the family's refuge from work and outside world. I mentally peep through the half-open door to see a roaring fire in the hearth. Its flickering flame lights up the room, giving a sense of comfort, intimacy and seclusion. The overmantel contributes its part towards the glittering reflected light. Opposite the fire, against the wall in the far corner, a light wood upright piano stands with its keyboard cover open. The candle holders have long been removed. The music rack still carrying an open book of music, and the floor piled high with sheet music around the stool. In the winter, before my father could play the piano, its action was made up of felted hammers mounted on a wooden frame, tended to swell with the damp. The front cover of the piano was removed, and the action lifted out. Before tea served in the kitchen, the backroom fire was lit, and the piano's action propped up on the fireboxes resting each side of the fender, and every now and again the hammers tested for freedom of movement. This was a weekend's normal job, after chopping the wood, buying Rosemary's tobacco and bringing home the weekend treats, whelks, celery, watercress or iced cakes. On a number of occasions a lorry would turn up at 31 Cumberland Road with its load of wood gleaned from the railway when repairs and surplus wood was left over, and it was this wood that my father cut up, then chopped up to form kindling, and we boys joined in, helping to stack the logs in the coal house, and this became a Saturday morning task to prepare the wood for the following week. What is driving me to open the family photo album and look at my parents' wedding day picture, perhaps to try and read how they were feeling, preparing to face their future. Were they trepidatious, as Stan and I? According to the picture, Mum looks happy and excited. Was Dad's face giving him away? Was he beginning to contemplate his new responsibilities? My parents were standing just inside Roseley Cottage, the doormats covered in confetti, the black of night as the cottage interior in silhouettes the couple in the doorway. The picture in my mind is full of questions and what-ifs. The wedding photographs taken in 1933 place the event in School Lane, Tatworth, close upon Chard in Somerset. Unfortunately, we do not know the precise day nor month the picture was taken. The cottage was purposely built for the family and named Roseley, after Rosa, standing opposite the village school in School Lane. Grandfather was a mill engineer and my mother a lace loom operator before becoming Mrs. Roper's lady's maid. Henry Alfred Collins and Rosa Jane, née Beavis, parents to 8 boys and 8 girls. The doorway framed by ivy which covers the brickwork to its right side, facing us. His closed, soaked, shiny umbrella gives a clue to the day's weather. It was raining. My father was 44, a much decorated regimental sergeant major of the Kensington's Rifle Regiment, a dedicated Freemason and original founding member of the Old Contemptibles in 1925. As cartage manager of the London North Eastern Railway, highly knowledgeable about London's roads and byways, he was what could be described as a man about town. Elsie was 25. She clasps his right elbow, holding in her other arm a bouquet, which trails down her white wedding dress, taking your gaze down to the white shoes. She is smiling, her face framed by her head covering and lace shawl. She's happy, expectant, and fulfilled. A small umbrella peeps out from behind her. Elsie has given up her job as Mrs. Roper's lady's maid not long before. In the picture she looks beautiful and relaxed. My father, white-gloved hands crossed in front, holds a light-coloured trilby with a black hatband. He's dressed in black jacket and pinstripe trousers. A white handkerchief shows boldly from his top pocket below a white buttonhole. His placid face hardly reveals his moustache, which white shirt and silver tie. His black shoes shine as always. The picture is remarkable for its solitary position in my album. There's no guests to cover, no crowd outside St. John's the Evangelist Church to throw confetti. There are no other records of the event. I have but this one photo to look at and wonder about. Chapter 6. Apprenticeship. After completing my paper round and finished breakfast, I met David Villas under North Harrow Station's railway bridge to decide whether we were going to take the bus to the Odeon at Rayners Lane or to go to the ABC Cinema, North Harrow, to see that week's Saturday morning pictures. Each cinema chain had its own special song to be sung before the film started, and a serial to finish. Cartoons were a popular show which included Daffy Duck, Bugs Bunny, Porky Pig, Mickey Mouse, as were westerns, Gene Autry, Hopalong Cassidy and Roy Rogers with Trigger and Gabby Hayes. The Bowery Boys with Slip Mahoney, and American comedy shows Laurel and Hardy, Abbott and Costello, Charlie Chaplin and the Three Stooges. They were never to be forgotten. How inoffensive they all were, and how we look forward to seeing them. The crush to get in and pay your sixpence was enormous. At this time of year we would be travelling the streets, singing carols, painting a £2 jar with a grid pattern to simulate a lantern. By placing a candle inside, it looked exactly like a lantern. With my paper round money, this came in handy. Christmas was the most exciting time of the year, and we bathed in it. My father was not only an expert player on the piano, but the organ and penny whistle too. The ability to play the piano, first learned when he was 4, led him to play at his school's morning assemblies, and then later still at the local picture house in the early 1900s, and then playing the organ. And he was to be found at the Masonic Hall for invitations and services. The penny whistle picked up when, as a member, attending the Kensington Regiment's territorial drill nights, who had a regimental drum and fife band. At home, the settee was pulled up closer to the fire, blanking off the opposite wall, sealing it in darkness. My father's armchair to the left of the fire controlled the wireless set, and blanked off a small table carrying the day's book. He occupied the chair with a pipe in his mouth. He was an inveterate smoker of rosemary tobacco all his life, until warned of cancer later, which made him stop. It was his knell of passing day. The radio was playing Sidney Thompson's orchestra, playing old-time dancing, a regular weekly programme which shared a spot with Harry Davidson's orchestra, something that the whole family enjoyed. The piece of music turned back on the piano was the Teddy Bear's Picnic. My father had me stand by him to turn over the music and to sing. My brother Stan was busy completing a quiz based upon radio's Monday night at 8's guessing game. Mum sat in the armchair opposite, rewinding a ball of wool that was once a jumper, while Stan held the skein of wool. A damp piece of wood spat out from the fire with a crack. It landed on the homemade wool carpet. Father dropped his book and snapped up the shovel, flicking it back into the fire. A smell of burning wood lingered. The log of wood at the back against the fire bricks smouldered, its edges sparkled and glowed. Flickering bursts of bright embers chased each other up the log and onto the back of the grate. They looked like soldiers advancing. Occasionally one was killed, but the others kept up the advance. It was soon to be time for supper. Cheese sandwich and a cup of tea. Bedtime not too far away. The fire still burning brightly. Perhaps just a few more minutes. As Edgar Lustgarten, the man in black, continued his tales of horror and crime on the radio. Would it be churlish not to include in my list of memories Nan? In the 1930s, Nan was governess to Mrs. Roper's children at Ford Abbey, a respected senior house position. All aristocratic and landed gentry estates had a hierarchy of servants made up of those who served the landowner and his family, their personal helpers, gentleman's valet, lady's maid, governess, in-house staff, butler, footman, household staff, kitchen, chef, cook, upstairs maids, estate workers, grooms, kennel maids, stable lads, kitchen garden staff and woodmen. My mother joined the house staff in about 1931, after serving before the looms at the lace mill in Perry Street, South Chard, for 10 years. And she was chosen by Mrs. Roper to become her lady's maid, striking up a friendship in-house with Nan, who was then the children's governess. Their friendship lasted for the rest of their lives. Nan's personal belongings occupied our box room at 31 Cumberland Road, and over the many years Nan would occasionally visit her relations in Penzance, keeping up a link there. It was Nan's interest in my future which got me my first job. One of her work positions was by chance with Mr. and Mrs. Frank Oppenheimer's house. As owner of the Como Works printing works, she was engaged as a housekeeper and cook. And at a dinner party one evening, having finished cooking the meal, she began to serve. And it was during this that she overheard a conversation about the firm having difficulty in obtaining an apprentice in the artist department. The present apprentice was due to come out of his time. Knowing that I enjoyed painting and drawing, she approached Frank Oppenheimer after the meal, asking if she could introduce me to the firm. He applauded the idea and asked for a letter to be sent making the offer. This my father did, and so I found myself gathering up my artworks into a portfolio, accompanying my father to the arranged interview, where I was introduced, my work looked at, and an offer of an apprenticeship was made. It was agreed that I should start when I was 15, in a few weeks' time, when the school packed up for summer holidays. Part of my father's animosity towards Nan was her obvious exceptional education. Unfortunately, Nan was small, having problems with her legs, and she suffered from rejection as a child, to the extent that she moved away from home, taking up nursing, concentrating on childcare as a children's nurse and governess, travelling to America, China and France. Nan would visit 31 Cumberland Road off and on throughout the many years she was working, when she had a holiday or became ill, before going back into service immediately afterwards. Over the years, having a lady's maid became unusual. Ladies began to look elsewhere for personal attention to hair, clothes and dressing. The First World War killed so many officers who were mainly from the landed gentry that future generations of first sons did not become estate owners. Those estates that did survive became too expensive to maintain, and this had a knock-on effect to those who looked to the large houses to give them an occupation. Amongst them were the governesses. When Nan paid one of her holidays or recuperation periods as a 5-year-old in 1940, I would climb into her bed and be regaled with stories of Tarzan and the apes and such tales of daring do. And during the time spent at 31, Nan would be rigorously crocheting another table mat or table runner, sitting before the fire, listening to the radio, often reading the teacups during the afternoon. In the 1940s, Nan took on the job of live-in cook housekeeper, which carried her through life until retirement, and finally ending up living with my parents in their council flat in Pinner. When my mother died during a diabetic coma in 1971, Nan and my father lived together for a number of years before both needing care, each going to different care homes in the borough. There had always been a suggestion that they never really got on together, having a clash of temperaments, which may have been a reason for splitting up, going their separate ways. I survived my first 3 months of work and settled down. The union members had voted that I should stay and that I should attend all meetings in the firm, and my turn to attend the monthly union meeting in Doughty Street in London, and to report back to the members. I carried on, completing my apprenticeship over the next 2 years, bringing me up to the age of 17. This was the maximum age for membership of the Boys' Brigade, which meant I had to leave with the rest of my friends who had also joined at the same time. The three of us decided to join the Royal Marine Forces Volunteer Reserve, which is what we did, having to volunteer for 9 years to attend weekly and attend a fortnight's camp each year. The training for the first year and its camp considered sufficient to be considered commando status. We would then be able to do our national service with the Corps, which would otherwise we would be unable to do. And when the time came round to select which wing, I chose Sea Service, ending up eventually in Beach Party Section, Poole Harbour. Chapter 7. Industrial Changes. As I continue to look back through the ages, trying to imagine life in Victorian times, when my grandparents were born, thinking how difficult it must have been in a crowded city bursting with life when the first mainline stations were being built just after the canals had functioned as bulk carriers. Paddington is a central London terminus provided by the Great Western Railway and its successors since 1838. It was designed by Kingdom Brunel. The station was well known for its delivery of milk and parcels, and Paddington was first served by London Underground trains in 1863 as the original western terminus of the Metropolitan Railway, the world's first underground system. To bring about the original station on its present site, a massive eviction of all those who lived there was taken, forcing out the population. The station eventually being closed to where the Careys lived, within a short distance for Albert, who was the station's cartage manager. Martha's father had been a vicar in London, and his father vicar to the Mayor of London. Martha married Alfred Carey in Kensington in 1878 and had 8 boys and 3 girls, Lillian being the eldest. Martha had been trained as a schoolteacher, and her father believed she had married beneath her station, having given up teaching when married. To help maintain the family, Martha started a laundry at home, servicing the local gentry in Kensington, and it was Alfred's grandfather Thomas who was born in 1791, who left Dublin, married Esther Pepler, and had 2 boys and 5 girls, and he began the West London side of the Carey family. Just after the war, Stan and I were given a Sunday morning task to visit Grandma Carey in Eastcote. She was bedridden, lying next to the window in the sitting room, and near to her a bidet, the closed top holding her hearing trumpet, Bible and glasses. There seemed little purpose for the trumpet, because she could never hear us talking. Grandma was looked after by Lillian, Dad's eldest sister, who during the day worked in the local bread and cake shop in Eastcote, frequently having such tasty morsels for us boys to finish off. Auntie Lil would present us with sticks of crunchy and homemade toffee when we departed. It was in the field behind the house in Eastcote in 1946, where there were rows upon rows of army trucks, surplus ex-WD equipment, lined up ready to be sold to the public. In the asbestos garage at the bottom of the garden, Uncle Ken's tools for maintaining his sports car was also waiting for him to return from the war. Ken, a sergeant in the Remy, maintained the Army's vehicles and was Dad's youngest brother and our favourite and most exciting uncle. I've no idea at all what our neighbours thought about us Careys, what with Dad killing the cat's kittens by dropping them in a sack with a brick into the water butt, or killing our pet rabbit with a cricket bat. However, Stan and I, with the Williams boys next door, played hide and seek from our bedroom windows. We each had to hide in our gardens, and guessed where, from our high vantage spot, shouting out where on high Frank and Victor went to John Lyons School, a private school, and it showed. The Tripps earned a living gambling at the Greyhound track in Wembley. They had a cooking cherry tree and an enormous poplar tree at the bottom of their garden, and we scrumped their cherries and the Williams apples. Frank Williams would act little plays for us to enjoy, which were always amusing and comical. Infrequently the family visited the grandparents in Somerset, taking a train from Waterloo to end up at Jar Junction to walk the rest of the way to School Lane. In the evenings, whilst we visited the Collins for our summer holidays, we played whist with our uncles just back from the Pop Inn down the road. Grandad comfortably ensconced in his smoker's chair next to the fire smoking his briar pipe, and when he spoke it was in the broad West Country dialect, totally foreign to us townsfolk. The playing cards were dealt out as we gathered round using the long green baize-covered dining table, centred in the low-beamed dining room opposite the wood-burning range. The room was lit by the solitary oil lamp as it flickered in the table's centre, only capable of lighting the beaming faces intently following the cards. Grandma would ask when the plates from the dinner were put away, when every hand was dealt. "What's trumps?" calling diamonds, diamonds, in a high-pitched, quaking voice, the folds of her neck quivering. Stan and I excused ourselves, for we had to go out into the dark to the bottom of the garden where the outside toilet was, to sit on the carved wooden seat looking at its creaking ledged and braced door, fearing that at any moment a large hairy spider would drop down our nets from the roof, not forgetting to fill up the bucket from the mill stream which flowed out over the ford in the road. I tried vainly to pretend that I wasn't scared of the dark, and failed miserably in my haste to get back to the card table. This was the prelude to us boys going to bed, taking a candle up the creaking stairs, casting ghostly shadows on the walls about us, just waiting for a skinny arm to reach out to us as we passed. missing the chattering, laughing company in the warm and cosy room below. We could hear them all. Until we reached our room, we dived into bed to surface once more to listen to the owls hooting and the foxes barking, occasionally hearing a poor bird being killed as it screamed and fluttered in its death throes. The chickens at the bottom of the garden that were safely caged in, clucking madly, fearing the worst as they waited for daybreak. Meanwhile, we boys were soon asleep, dreaming of successfully damming the stream which passed over the road outside the garden gate the following day. This blessed holiday in 1943 was soon to be over, and for us to take the steam train back to London, Waterloo and Harrow. Aunt Vera lived in a house attached to the courthouse, accessed by a narrow opening in Forecourt Street, Chard's main town. The town was in the manor of the Bishop of Wells, and in 1235 the then bishop created the centre into the market town of Chard, believed to be the original Camelot of King Arthur. Its main street holds Waterloo House and Manor Court House, built in 1600, where Charles I signed the peace declaration during the Civil War. Vera's home had all the composite details of an old house, with latticed windows and stone walls. And in 1943 the town was besieged by American soldiers, as were all southern towns. As children we pestered them. "Got any gum chum or candy, Andy?" The men were elegantly dressed compared to our scruffy soldiers, the officers in tailored army suits. Stan and I raced our poo sticks down each side's gutters, where different streams flowed through the town. The market was fascinating, for it was an animal auction as well as having numerous stallholders. Vera's husband Horace never returned. After a period of grace, Vera divorced him, never to remarry. In conclusion, there has been a drawing in of family life, prompted by personal entertainment equipment, a greater increase in mobility by the numbers of licensed drivers. There has been a freedom from family ties with far higher ownership of property, smaller families with parents having a far greater interest in education and welfare for their children. More women are taking on far more traditional male roles, working longer hours. Although equal pay is still not universal, but it's getting there. Working from home is becoming a new national cry, which in itself is going to change home facilities and conveniences. Television has pushed artistic and scientific interests, and the environment is becoming the leading source of interest for improvement and growth for the country. There is, however, a decrease of interest in the Commonwealth, Europe and America.